feels quite strange giving these from here and not up there. So our chair for the night is Professor Patrick Gagan. He's a professor in modern Irish history in the Department of History at Trinity College Dublin. He presents a weekly slot on News Talk where he discusses historical issues. He's a vice president of the College Historical Society, and he's been commissioned to write a history of the society for our 250th anniversary in 3 years' time. He's also well known as one of Trinity's funniest lecturers, so expect great things from his speech at the end of the debate. On our judging panel up at the back there, then we have Mary Sinoe in the chair. She's the Group Head of Compliance and Risk at the Electricity Supply Board, or ESB, which is Ireland's leading energy utility. She's worked in a number of senior management roles across the ESB group. In her current role, she's responsible for enterprise risk management function, which oversees the critical risk management process across the group. I understand as much of that as you do, don't worry. And she provides regular assurance to the Audit and Risk Committee on risk and compliance matters. She's a commerce graduate of UCD, so she's completely unbiased in this. And she holds a Master in Economic Policy Studies from TCD, so she's actually not unbiased. And she also has a postgraduate diploma in corporate governance from UCD. Then to her left, we have Ursula Quill. She was the auditor of the HIST in 2012. She was a Shannon assistant to Senator Sean Barrett for 3 years, working as a researcher on the banking inquiry, and she now works for Senator Ivana Bacik, where she's also drafting a policy paper on Brexit for the Labour Party. And then to Marie's right is Shane O'Munnachan, and Dr. O'Munnachan currently works as a policy and data analyst for LinkedIn and is an adjunct assistant professor in the Trinity Department of Political Science. He is a former CORSEC of the HIST and a former launch manager of the Student Economic Review. He's represented Trinity in the STR debates on 6 occasions, no less. Discussing such subjects as Britain's membership of the EU, the role of migration, the need to tackle climate change, and bemoaning American dominance in the world. He looks forward to the Student Economic Review debates, continuing to tackle new topics for discussion. I'll hand you back over to the chair now to start the debate.
Over dinner, I did ask Dr. Shane O'Munnachan that could he remember how many of those 6 SER debates had he won? And of course, you know, it's all in the past. People don't keep records. And 4. He won 4, best speaker in 2. So an impressive record. Probably the most capped SER debater in Trinity history. The motion before the House this night is that this House believes the EU is unsustainable. We have the University of Oxford proposing the motion. We have Trinity College Dublin opposing the motion. I will now call on first...
Before you do, apologies, sorry, I just forgot to say. So speeches for this debate are 9 minutes in length for the teams, and no points of information can be offered from the floor, only from opposing teams. So please don't offer any points of information from the floor. There'll be floor speeches at the end by 4 speakers, and you can offer points of information to them as many times as you'd like. Yes. Sorry? No one can offer any points apart from the teams.
Okay, very good. So only points of information from the competitive speakers. The first speaker for the proposition is a second-year chemistry student at New College in Oxford. Will you please welcome Annabelle Lawrence?
Brexit or no Brexit, this House believes the European Union is unsustainable. Mr. Chair, honourable adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, this House, and we on the proposition bench, believe that the unsustainability of the European Union falls into 3 main categories. Firstly, it is politically, it is also economically, and finally, it is socially unmaintainable, and these categories will form the basis of our speech tonight. Before I start, I'd like to thank TCD HIST for inviting us to your chamber this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, there is simply no common political culture in Europe. There is no common media, no common sense of humour or satire or even language. So if my accent confuses you tonight, it is definitely not the content of my debate. But I digress. Fundamentally, in the EU, there is no true awareness of each other's politics. From a new socialist France to a free market Germany, the European Union has to make itself different things to different people, and these are not always congruous. And so the EU is forced to break the promises which bind the people together. And this is in part why people become dissatisfied with the EU. But what do we actually mean by unsustainable? So firstly, there's the notion of philosophically unsustainable. It is outlined in the 1993 Copenhagen criteria that member states must be stable institutions guaranteeing democracy. This conflicts with the very fact that the EU is necessarily anti-democratic and holds the power to override this necessary element of membership. It is inconsistent that the EU does not uphold the very moral standards it requires of its members. Secondly, there is the idea that it is existentially unsustainable. Never before have we seen such waves of stirring Euroscepticism, no thank you, throughout the continent. Without the support of its membership and with countries threatening to leave, there is real danger to the existence of the EU and makes its institution weak. It cannot be disputed that the EU is becoming increasingly unpopular. 40% of Austrians, 42% of Danes, 53% of French, 58% of Italians, and 61% of Dutch want referendums on their membership. More than half of Dutch, half Danes, half Italians, half French, and half Austrians would vote to leave if they were given the choice, according to recent polls.
Right.
Yes.
Do you think the Cold War was more or less of a challenge for the EU than the issues of today?
I think the Cold War united the EU. That's part of the reason why it came to be, but I don't think that the EU has gone so far from what it was founded as an economic union, that it is simply unsustainable. As I was saying, in the wake of the British exit, we see an increasing trend towards independence and self-governance. Jean-Claude Juncker himself has remarked, albeit with disapproval, that too many Europeans are returning to national or regional mindsets. This isn't a localized problem, but rather a frightening global trend, as can be seen in the recent US elections of Mr. Trump, who's promised an isolationist policy throughout his election campaign. In the face of such dissent, European elites are doing exactly the thing their people don't want them to do. Instead of devolving power, they are centralizing. Instead of going with the grain of human nature and giving people the right to choose their government, they're reaching for the same corrective behavioral therapy time and time again. More legislation, more federal control. Wherever there is a crisis of any time, the same, more Europe, more Europe. What did they say when the Berlin Wall came down and the French worried about the inevitability of German unification? More Europe. And what are they saying now when the ensuing single currency has become a disaster? More Europe. They persist in the delusion that political cohesion can be created and fathomed by forcible integration simply through legislation. There is, ladies and gentlemen, a clear disconnect between the people of Brussels and the people of Europe. I ask you, in the wake of economic collapse in Greece, do the Greeks feel warmer towards the Germans or the Latvians? Do they feel connected by a common interest? Certainly not. In Austria, the far right have just won an election for the first time since the 1930s. The United Kingdom Independence Party are the third most popular party in the UK, and Le Front National, the National Front, are on the march in France. Marianne Le Bayrou, as Rory brought up earlier, is the daughter of a Holocaust denier, is predicted, nay expected, to reach the final stages of the presidential election. You cannot stand here and say that EU integration is promoting either mutual cultural or political understanding. No, thank you. Rather, it is driving our nations apart under the desire for national independence. A crucial reason for the dissatisfaction with the EU arises from the fact it is anti-democratic. It can be considered a necessary sin that the EU is anti-democratic, in that otherwise its powers directly conflict with the sovereignty of individual nations. But why do I refer to it as a necessary sin? It is necessary because the EU has no single demos. no single people. It is an amalgamation of separate cultures, communities, and languages. The word democracy means people power. It is a system where choices are made as closely to the people as possible. There is no self-identifying European demos. I'm happy to identify as European, but I do not regard my German or Latvian or French counterparts as my countrymen. Though we are all born of the same civilization, our language and culture and traditions make us foreign to one another. The necessary bond to make us a demos cannot be forced nor imposed, though the EU may wish, through legislation. It is simply not present at a continental level. Initially set up, no thank you, as a purely economic union to regulate the single market and govern free trade, the EU could not be democratic when it was founded because it would interfere with the individual sovereignty of nation states. The founding principles were never political, purely economic. Explicitly, if it was ever going to get involved in politics, it would need a democratic mandate, which it does not have, because, as I mentioned, this would conflict with the mandates of individual sovereign parliaments, and this would inherently be a bad thing. The real issue now is that those who run the EU have overstepped the initial remit. For want of power or driven by greed, I don't know, but the EU should never have got involved in political affairs, don't you agree?
If the EU is so undermining to all these countries, why even in the midst of the economic collapse where Albania, Serbia, Montenegro clamouring to get in?
Because it is inherently beneficial for certain countries, but the countries within the EU are so divided. They have massive poverty gaps, massive gaps in the facilities that they can offer, that you have this massive migration from less wealthy countries to more wealthy countries. They're not a single people. They're people with very different home lives, very different cultures and traditions. And these people from these countries are not aligned with necessarily, they don't have the same benefits from their governments that you do in other European countries. So the EU should never have got involved in political affairs, but sadly it seems that European bureaucrats are not even prepared to stop here. In recent years, Brussels has acquired its own foreign minister, its own secretaries of EU embassies around the world, and it's continuing to develop its own defence policy. We have to stop trying to kid ourselves. We need to look at the reality that this is a continuing acceleration to build a country called Europe by those in charge, wholly unsupported by their people. The executive power of the EU lies in the Commission, which is crucially not elected. They act as a higher authority above the government of nation states. The Commission has two principal features. Firstly, it is supreme lawmaking, and secondly, it has the right of initiative, which means that the only way that a law can get accepted, passed, or even started is by going through the Commission. Parliament has no true power. This evening, I have spoken not just about the present issues facing the EU, which may coincidentally make it look bad. I have highlighted structural flaws, defects within the organisation, which have no remedy. The EU has gone far beyond its initial remit of economic union. The organisation that stands before us today is unaccountable, unpopular, and unsustainable. I urge you to propose.
I would now like to call on the first speaker for the opposition and the first speaker for Trinity, a third-year economics and sociology student, Meg Beer.
I think that marks the first time my name has ever been pronounced correctly in this chamber. Aini Uashla. I do not believe that the differences in will between the people of Greece and the people of Lithuania are greater than the differences in belief and political will between those who voted for Clinton and those who voted for Trump. We are not as divided as the US. It was pointed to, how could you ever have a political entity with so many different languages and cultures? And yet, I do not believe that the home life and the culture of someone who's Swiss-Italian is closer to the home life and culture of someone who's Swiss-German than the home life and culture of someone who is Belgian is to someone who is from Luxembourg. So many examples exist of people from vastly different cultures who do not speak the same language coming together for their own economic, I don't think I put my timer on, economic and political, coming together through economic and political union for their own benefit. This has happened so many times already, and to simply point to like, oh, different, definitely not going to work together is simply not something that we can accept. The European Union is probably the greatest political project ever undertaken. Never before have so many different cultures and nationalities been brought together through democracy.
On that point.
I'm not going to take you right now, but maybe in a minute or two. Okay, and just if you think that like the Commission is inherently undemocratic, we haven't always had a Commission. We might have a Commission in the future. The EU is quite stable as it is, but even if it weren't, the fact that the EU has gone from a coal and steel community but has been flexible and open-minded enough to shift and change makes us certain that it'll continue long into the future. Probably not as we know today. I don't think anyone in this room thinks that the EU is going to stay a static institution, that everything that we have in place now is going to last for 1,000 years. But what we have, the fact that we have put this motion put the wheels in motion, means that there will always be a European political, we believe that there's going to be a European political entity for a long time. The European Union has been characterised more by its willingness and ability to shift focus and purpose, whatever the needs of the age may be and what the will of the people calls for. The political institutions are always hypocritical and are always pragmatic. Yes, often in almost every constitution, we've an idea somewhere that contradicts an idea somewhere else. This is not a fatal flaw in a political entity. That is how politics works. Do you not agree?
How many times do you think that aspects of a thing can change before you say it is no longer that same entity?
I mean, there's no such, you can't step in the same river twice. Sorry, as in like, you know, if the same thing is that there is a cohesive European political identity, that there's a cohesive European economic structure, that there's a cohesive system, I'm not, no. Like, the European Coal and Steel Association is almost as unrecognisable to us as we will be to people in 100 years. The British government from 200 years ago would be completely unrecognisable to us as a political institution, but I don't say to you that the United Kingdom has been unsustainable. It changed, it was supposed to. All things are supposed to change. It's natural and normal. The challenge for side proposition today is to show us how an organisation which, despite years of upsets, has consistently had people clamouring to get in, is somehow on the verge of implosion. People are always going to want to be part of the European Union because it caused a fundamental shift in terms of relationships between member countries, and a fundamentally new paradigm in international relations. Shifted the international system from one based on power, be that military power in the past or economic power more recently, to one that's based on rules. This is predictable, it's fair, it's not prone to the minor crises which, when someone breaks a trade agreement and then you have someone breaks a trade agreement without anyone having predicted it, and then the retaliation that no one could have possibly predicted. The European Union has changed that because we know exactly what the response is going to be. We know exactly what all the parameters are on every side. This is an unprecedented level of predictability which has brought peace, which has brought organisation. We have never before seen something like this, and it's such a massive improvement that so Ronan's going to explain to you how all people of Europe understand this, or at least sufficient people in Europe understand this, that they will act it. The EU acts as a guarantor of good institutions. You've got to get your institutions up to scratch before you can sit at the table. We all keep each other accountable and promoting good institutions across the continent. And it gives some of the new, less developed, members an opportunity to show the world that their institutions are of a high standard, something which is critical to countries who can often be chained to their history. The EU can lose one or two people. They only named like a small handful of countries that potentially, maybe, possibly in the future, sometime down the line, maybe, perhaps, might leave. We've so many people, A, in the club, no thank you, and so many people wanting to get in the club. We're fine. We're fine. The EU is not necessarily the current 27 member states. It can shift from the member states we have to different member states and still have a cohesive, continuous identity, okay? Beyond this, the influence that they gain, that we all gain, by being part of the EU is monumental. The EU gets a seat at every table one might want to sit at. Speaking in aggregate, we're so much more influential than the sum of our influence because the proportion of power and money that we make up. Very few countries are going to want to actually give this up in practice. This is one of those things where we might talk about potentially leaving, but ultimately most people will decide to stay. This is especially vital when it comes to security concerns like Islamist terrorism and the resurgent Europe. The market that we have created is an incredible gift to the people of Europe. Far from adding our assets together, we've multiplied them. One of the key reasons we've been able to weather the storm of globalization is that we have one of the most efficient open market systems in the world. This is as more and more pressures are put on Europe economically in a increasingly globalized market, as more and more countries become economically important. The fact that we have an open market and that we work together is only going to help us. As I said, Ronan is going to explain how Europeans across the continent understand this and are still very much in favour of staying in Europe. The EU will not fall so long as people want it there, and most people still want it there. Ever since the latest round of wobbles, Romania, Bulgaria and Croatia have all gained entry and it seems their economies improved massively. Albania, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro, where public support for the EU stands at 80%, and I struggle to remember the last time 80% of people supported anything, are all clamouring to get in. We can lose a country or two. Proposition have pointed to Brexit as a key example, but Britain is and always was an exceptional case. The watered-down EU of the 1970s was almost too much of it. With neither Schengen nor the euro, they never fully integrated. They never bought into it the way everyone else did. They were never as needy, both economically strong and not savaged by the Second World War. Their attachment to it was low. They have a culture of exceptionalism to rival America, and it's not just in their exceptional habit of stealing countries to civilize them, but I do think I have to agree with them in this case and say that they were fundamentally different. Oxford want to tell us that the European Union needs the UK. Don't flatter yourself. You're the ones whose economy is tanking. And given the resurgence of Scottish nationalism and renewed calls for a border cull, perhaps a more prescient debate would be on the sustainability of the United Kingdom. The EU was driving slow in the fast lane. The EU was driving slow in the fast lane, and given that they're gone, we can now become more cohesive and more logical. We can start making the Europe that actually everyone else already wanted in the first place. Yes, the EU has faced problems in the last few years, but these challenges are short-term. They seem big to us now, obviously, because we're in the middle of them. The EU survived the Cold War with Russia on its doorstep. The EU survived the oil crisis, the dot-com boom. All these things were massive in their time. They were way bigger than the oil crisis and stuff like this. The migrant crisis should have put Greece in the hands of Golden Dawn. It did not. Germany has both the political and economic power to pull these countries together. We're all, with Merkel going to become the leader of the free world on January 8th, we're all going to want to be in her club. And Germany needs the EU nearly as much as we need it, because the euro and the free market are what's keeping its exports competitive. People have seen the future, and it's European. Please oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, I actually don't know much about economics. But I do know enough to tell you that the European Union doesn't either, so bear with me. 3 core areas of rebuttal that we heard in Meg's speech. Firstly, we heard about the virtues of the European Union in the past, especially the Cold War. We do concede that. We think that the Union has been an excellent force in holding people together. They've been an excellent force in holding people together when there was the Warsaw Pact in effect. But we don't believe fundamentally that the fact that the EU has been a functional joiner in the past means that it is necessarily sustainable in the future. Second point, Meg said, the EU can change, it can shift, it can be dynamic. Well, what do you get if the EU shifts and you join the EU thinking it was for a certain purpose? What you get are broken promises. The same broken promises that lead to the rise of populism and Marie Le Bayrou in France itself. The final point in Meg's speech is that, we have countries like Macedonia, loving it and wanting to join. You tell me how easy it is to form a trade bloc made of mostly services and technical industries when most of the countries in your trade bloc are countries with very low GDPs who are mostly recently industrialising. The UK is not holding you back, it is giving you the funding to pursue the high-income investment projects that you wish to pursue that are no longer going to be sustainable. 3 points of substantive in this speech on economics, my favourite subject. Firstly, monetary policy without fiscal policy is really stupid. Secondly, we need to get a realistic analysis of the European labour market, and that's a pretty shit one. Thirdly, the common agricultural policy is literally the paradigm example of inefficiency. It does not get more laughably bad than milk quotas, ladies and gentlemen. And it is as bad as it sounds, milk quotas. So the first thing is, monetary without fiscal policy is incredibly dumb. I have to forward that this relates to the Eurozone, but we believing that taking on the Euro is an inexorable part of joining the European Union unless an opt-out means that the Eurozone is prima facie part of the European Union. So we are happy to discuss the Eurozone as the primary issue. Monetary policy is the changing of interest rates to influence the supply of money in an economy. Fiscal policy is the changing of tax and expenditure receipts to influence the aggregate demand in the economy. In Australia, the country where I did high school economics, the monetary policy is done by the Reserve Bank, which is an independent but public body. Fiscal policy is done by the federal government. These are two separate institutions, but importantly, they are the same size. That is that they are both accountable to the national population. They have the same body of stakeholders. They are working for the same group of people. However, this is not the case in the Eurozone. What you have is the European Central Bank settling monetary policy and fiscal policy being set by domestic governments. There are 3 issues with this. Each is like as bad as the other. I'm not sure, you pick, they're all pretty bad. Firstly is the free rider problem. And this is where you are going to have to listen because there is a bit of economic analysis. So what happens when you have cost-push pressures, that is, inputs for economic output getting more expensive, is that you have an output gap, where the efficiency of an economy is lower than what it would ideally be in certain countries. Because individual countries we can't have unemployment and bad things, they start pumping money into the economy, even though the European Central Bank doesn't want them to do this. Because they think, hey, we're only one country out of the Eurozone. If no one else does this, it's fine. But every country does this. And this is what is called the free rider problem. Seeing this, you have huge inflationary pressures from giant government expenditure, which means the European Central Bank raises inflation rates to counteract this. Even though on a European scale, there is no actual overall increase in inflation whatsoever, which means that you get worse inefficiency and you get worse economic output gap. You get worse unemployment. You get the situation where it just isn't working out. And this compounds with every single other inefficiency argument on the board for economics. Secondly, there is a mismatch of supply and demand. If monetary policy is supply and fiscal policy is demand, when you're dealing with them on 2 separate scales, there's a mismatch. 2 problems. Firstly, it was implicit in the Eurozone formation that every single country would have the same risk of borrowing as Germany, and that was on the monetary policy side of things, which meant then that everyone was willing to supply the same amount of money to every Eurozone country. When Portugal borrows at the same rate that Germany had previously borrowed, but Portugal is a country that spends shitloads of money on public expenditure, this leads to Portugal borrowing as much money as it can, which is more under the Eurozone, and spending it all out of proportion to an unsustainable level. That is why Portugal is completely messed up at the moment. They were offered really cheap money, and like any country would, they took it. Secondly, there is a shift away from private lending to public lending. Instead of private lenders who are able to say, look, we know that you're a shit government, you're not going to pay us back, so we're going to have high interest rates, what happens is that the public interest lenders were like, European identity, have lots of money, and now Portugal can't pay it back. Like, why that was a thing, I don't know. Secondly, there are conflicting interests between the European Central Bank and national authorities. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at Ireland. When Ireland was unable to have its banks pay off European bondholders, the European Central Bank ransomed Ireland into paying off European bondholders even though its national banks were state-owned and wouldn't have had to pay off European bondholders if the bailout hadn't occurred. What the European Central Bank has said, look, our monetary policy is more important than you spending the money on your citizens who are unemployed, your citizens who need healthcare and welfare, so what you're going to have to do first is pay out every single one of our big bank European bondholders in the European Union. That's ridiculous. No thank you, no thank you. Secondly, let's look at a realistic analysis of the European labour market. The freedom of movement is one of 4 freedoms. But what actually is the freedom of movement? There are differing accounts for this across the European Union because there are different conceptions of what the freedom of movement is. In France, we have a human rights-based conception of people can move where they want. In the Baltic states, we have labour as an economic input. And in the United Kingdom, we see freedom of movement at the price of entry for the other 3 freedoms. That is capital and goods and whatever the other one is. So whilst a broad freedom of labour doctrine is able to unite these concepts, unfortunately the implementation cannot. This is what is seen in the European Court of Justice case of Laval. A Latvian company built a school in Sweden. It employed Latvian workers, but it paid them Latvian wages and subjected them to Latvian labour standards. The problem is the Swedish labour unions were saying, look, Swedes can't get these jobs because in Sweden they're not willing to work for Latvian wages. Even more, they can't work for Latvian wages. This is Sweden. But the European Court of Justice completely undermined Sweden's labour law and said if you bring someone in from another country, they can work in that origin country's working conditions. There are 2 impacts of this. Firstly, this is the Bolkestein Directive, that labourers can work under their country of origin's domestic labour policy. This completely shits on the constitution of the European Union, which guarantees labour standards based on the home country. Secondly, this is social dumping, leading to inequality and the lowering of labour market standards to the lowest common denominator in the long run. Secondly, when countries view the freedom of labour as a price they have to pay into entering into the free market, what happens is that the country does not properly train its people to engage in the freedom of labour market. This is an example with most countries. If you look at the United States of America, 30% of US citizens lives in a state other than their state of birth. In the European Union, where freedom of labour is a thing, 3% of European nationals live in a country other than the country they came from. This is because there are so many barriers, language, etc., which is the reason why, even though there are jobs across Europe, half the youths in Spain which are unemployed cannot find these jobs abroad. Finally, as Annabelle alluded to, and Sophie will go on to, different conceptions of the freedom of labour means that there will be broken promises leading to populism. Thirdly, the common agricultural policy as a paradigm for inefficiency. So it inhibits the efficient allocation of resources. Historically, the reason why France wanted the common agricultural policy is because it said, we have all these rural labourers, we want to maintain the cheese farms, so you have to factor that into the European Union. So, does this preserve the way of life? Should this be a way of life we should preserve under the European Union? Firstly, we should not preserve rural values in the European Union for 5 reasons. Firstly, inefficient allocation of resources. Secondly, farmers are a minority of the population. They are 3% of the population, they contribute 6% of the GDP, but they get 1/3 of the European Union budget. Thirdly, welfare should be targeted to the poor, not just people who fill a particular job. Fourthly, it undermines the EU aid programme. For every €1 we give to Mozambique, we take away €8 of their income in trade tariffs that we put up that Mozambique would otherwise get by being able to sell its exports to us. Finally, it punishes efficiency. Milk quotas stop people producing milk over a certain amount. This is ridiculous considering the aim of competition is to maximise output over input. Finally, does the common agricultural policy even work? No. The reality is that those that get the money under the CAP are wealthy landholders. Queen Elizabeth II gets €500,000 euros a year, ladies and gentlemen, from the European Union. Monsanto and Nestle get huge amounts of money because they are the ones that hold the land. So not only is it like a completely inefficient allocation, but it is actually giving money to those companies that have hugely detrimental economic effects that counteract the environmental programs that the EU seeks to establish in the first place. So for these three reasons, the fact that the common agricultural policy is one of the many things that the EU does completely wrong, the fact that labour markets are implemented in a way that is not consistent across the member states, and the fact that monetary without fiscal policy is a really terrible idea, we beg you to propose.
I would now like to call on the second speaker for the opposition. Will you please, he's a rising fourth year mathematics student, will you please give a warm welcome to your auditor, Ronan McGilliwood.
Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union faces a crisis. The rise of the far right across the continent, the threat of Putin to the east and Trump to the west, the attempted secession of a member state, and the fact that Australia, a country literally the other side of the world, came runner-up in Eurovision this year, have all pushed the EU to breaking point. But far from tearing us apart, I and my teammates believe that this crisis and these problems, with the exception probably of Australia, will in fact draw us closer together, will unite us in solidarity, and will in fact bring about greater political integration, which in turn will lead to more economic stability. In particular, we think that this greater political integration which we envisage in the wake of this threat will lead to us countering the disunity that Oscar talked about in his speech. I noticed, just before I go on to my main stuff, just his idea that there will be broken promises because of this disunity. In any political system, there are always broken promises. There are always things that we cannot fulfill. There are always people that we cannot please. That does not tear political systems apart. In reality, if people see the benefits that they gain from certain things, even if they don't get everything they wanted, if it is more beneficial than not to stay in the European Union, we believe people will. In her speech earlier, in her speech earlier this evening, Meg outlined to you all of those benefits, why people might want to stay, from the single market to the union's influence in the global sphere. What I will attempt to do in my speech this evening is to show you why it is that people understand these benefits, can see them. It's not just that the EU is a good thing, but that voters perceive it as such and will want it to remain. So my aim will be to show you in the long term why the EU will survive the rising far-right anti-EU sentiment that it faces at the moment, and why this sort of veil that clouds people's judgment currently will be lifted. And the reason for this, ladies and gentlemen, is that the problems of today seem huge in comparison to the problems of yesterday. We regard what's in front of us as the most pressing, the most important thing, the likes of which we've never seen before. In reality, though, if we look at the major issues of today, at the rise of far-right sentiment, no thank you, what we're really talking about are just mutually exclusive ideologies that believe they cannot coexist. Similar, in fact, to what we saw in the Cold War, and that's why Gavin brought it up in his point of information. And far from tearing us apart, that brought us closer together. That crisis that we faced made us stronger. And while the motivation for anti-establishment, anti-EU sentiment will always be there so long as we have inequality, the factors that mobilise far-right sentiment are often short-term. Just a few years ago, our friends in the Phil were worried about inviting Nick Griffin, and now the BNP are a bunch of nobodies. The migrant crisis has similarly mobilised far-right sentiment. No, thank you. But this too is short-term. The EU has this massive pool of resources that it can use to deal with this, and although it has been slow to do so, when we see countries such as Jordan taking on millions of refugees, we realise that the EU are well equipped to deal with this, and will do so. We can overcome the emotional aspect that is often associated with these crises. So even though anti-EU sentiment grew in the wake of this, it started to to notice the long-term benefits that the EU can bring. And what exactly is it that voters notice? They notice an economy that has steadily improved since joining the EU. If they were in Poland, they noticed workers leaving to Ireland during the boom and coming back higher skilled, contributing to Poland's booming construction industry at the moment. If they were in a country that receives more money from the EU than they give, they noticed the improvement that that has made on their lives. Unlike in Britain, politicians can't just say that the EU is taking 350 million euros, which we can spend in our healthcare system. Often the EU is contributing to that healthcare system. If they're buying products online from across a border, or a business owner importing stock, they notice the lack of tariffs they have to pay and the ease with which they can do this. No, thank you. People realise the benefits that the EU has to their economy because those improvements have tangible, visible benefits on their lives. And this doesn't just apply to small countries like Germany, as Meg already pointed out, which is a net contributor, but still depends on the EU to keep its exports competitive. It still relies on the EU, and the people of Germany rely on the EU. No, thank you. And these long-term benefits, although they don't have the same emotional pull of the far right, they're much more obvious in the long term. When the emotion dies down, people realise these benefits. And this doesn't just apply to the economy. As Meg explained, the benefits the EU bring also include support of political institutions. The EU is the friend of democracy rather than its enemy. Now, much less in countries. No, thank you. To ease the transition from authoritarian people's interests, who is turning towards an authoritarian state, who is looking towards Russia instead of the EU. Those people realised and still do realise the importance of the EU to them in ensuring democracy and ensuring stability. The EU is a friend of democracy, not just in establishment, because Annabelle Trump is the political institution at the heart of the European Union. Funnily enough, we had the former Secretary General of the European Commission here just a few weeks ago, David O'Sullivan, and he went to great pains to explain to us how everything that the European Commission does comes from the European Parliament. At the end of the day, everything is still run by the European Parliament, by democratically elected members of Parliament, voted on, no thank you, by people in European countries. And we're told by Annabelle that just because we have this we have this diverse range of voters across Europe, that we can't function as a political system. Every political system has a diverse range of voters. My hometown of Naas has a diverse range of voters, and depending on what part of Naas you go to, they'll be speaking different languages, even if they do claim it's English. Like that diversity doesn't mean the breakdown of order and the breakdown of the system. Like, if anything, like some of the major threats the EU faces will draw us closer together. Russian expansionism is a really scary prospect at the moment. This isn't helped by Trump claiming that NATO won't be there to help that suburb of St. Petersburg that is Estonia. No, thank you. With a man whose main foreign policy is to not have any at all, European countries will rely on each other for support. We won't be torn apart because we can't afford to be torn apart. Seems to be driving us apart. Fear of Russia, fear of terrorism, those things are much stronger and will drive us together. And European identity is something we all share. And although Britain never really saw itself as part of this common identity, that's probably why our friends in Oxford can't envisage it. Like, they were never part of the EU in the same way. They never saw themselves as part of the continent. In reality, though, we have a shared history with Europe. We have a shared reliance on the EU since World War II. Like, this identity wasn't just forged by the institution of the European Union. It was something that naturally grew out of history. And it is something that the EU has helped to foster, particularly among young people. How many of our grandparents had the same ability to travel that we do? With freedom of movement and policies such as the Interrail pass, like, young Europeans are more connected than ever before. We share this affinity with young people throughout Europe. These people are the future of Europe, and they will support it much more so than their grandparents will. So there are emotional factors that bind people together in Europe, not just hard benefits. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is facing a crisis, but it is a crisis we can overcome. People have seen the future, and the future is European. Thank you.
I'd now like to call on the third speaker for the proposition, a third-year law student from Hartford College, where her hero is our own Roy Foster. Will you please welcome Sophie Cook? Please welcome Sophie Cork.
Honourable Chair, it's funny that Renan talked about history. 2017 will mark the centenary of the Battle of Doiran, a little known and a crushing defeat for the British Army, in which my great-grandfather sustained maiming injuries for which he was permanently disabled. 12,000 of his comrades died or were similarly injured. That is the kind of history that marks the kind of Europe that we now live in. The kind of Europe that came out of this patchwork of vanished kingdoms, that came out of people wanting to have nationalism. And we think that this kind of sacrifice, this kind of desire to be independent, this kind of desire for sovereignty, is exactly the kind of thing that is now under threat. It's exactly the kind of thing that leads to reactionary political movements. It's funny then when Renan talks about Eastern Europe. We'd like to ask how exactly it's working out for the people living under Viktor Orban's oppressive regime in Hungary, when he claims that the European Union is guaranteeing democracy, that is guaranteeing freedoms. We think that actually what's happening in Europe today is not an aberration. What we think is happening in Europe today is the consequence of a sustained campaign of ever closer union by some actors, by the same actors that smaller countries feel under threat by. So I'm going to be talking about the social ideal of Europe and how that's in tension with the European Union as it stands today. Firstly, though, I'm going to talk about what was already talked about by opposition in rebuttal. So the first thing to say to face this is that Ronan responded to literally nothing that Oscar said. Right? When he talks about how it's really difficult to have any kind of sustainable economy when people are operating at loggerheads but under the same currency, borrowing at the same rates and all that kind of thing, then this just went completely unresponded to. Probably because it's one of the biggest factors that makes the European unsustainable, right? When you have countries like Greece, which have a literally undemocratic, unelected government imposed by the EU, it makes it really difficult for side opposition in this debate to claim that the European Union is a sustainable actor for democracy in the world today. But now moving on to what they actually said on the opposition bench. Firstly, Meg's speech consisted entirely of sure to be grand-like. That is literally all she said in insisting that everything can change, but it'll all stay the same. It's a sort of Scooby-Doo villain of international relations, where it's always the same under the mask, right? But we don't think that that's the case. We think that the European Union, as it stands today, the gradual changes, the incremental changes that she tells us about, are exactly the kinds of things that make it unsustainable into the future. So therefore, and lastly, actually, on Meg's speech, I just wanted to point out that the second part of her speech was, now that we don't have Britain to impose their will, now it's time for the Western Europe to impose their will on the rest of Europe. I'm not sure quite how that's in any kind of principled consistency. So what Ronan was talking about. Firstly, when he talks about democracy, we think and how it's all fine because there's elections to the European Parliament. So we think that in any other political system, it's comparatively easier to have like direct accountability to the voters. At the moment, if I want to vote for my MEPs who are in Scotland, then then I can vote for them, but I can't vote for what happens in Germany. I can't vote for what happens in Latvia. That's the kind of thing that Annabelle was talking about when she was talking about how there's a democratic, that the kinds of democratic accountability systems there are in Europe don't really account for just how big, just how diverse, just how oppositional a lot of political interests in the European Union are. I'm going to be talking about democratic deficit a bit more later. Secondly, about colder about this stuff about the Cold War Europe. Again, I'm going to talk about this more later, but we'd just like to note at this point that the Cold War Europe was much more homogenous than Europe is today. We think that when you have a Europe that consists of countries like France, like Benelux, like Germany, then it's much easier to have cohesive political interests than it is now. The other thing I'd like to note about Cold War Europe was that they were able to pull together because they had the United States guaranteeing their interests. When we don't have that anymore, it's much more difficult for the European Union to act in the same way that it did before, given that, and I'm going to be, again, talking about that more later. Thirdly, when he talks about regions that have a lot of investment being really pro-European, I'd like to ask how that worked out for Wales, which has massive investment in things like car plants, in things like apprenticeships, in things like leisure centres, opportunities that wouldn't be there except apart from for the European Union, but it was still easy to paint the narrative picture of being ignored by the European Union that led them to vote leave in the Brexit referendum. Lastly, so moving on to the social model of Europe and how that makes that's its own unsustainability makes the European Union unsustainable. So what people think of when they think about Europe is things like high welfare spending. They think of the sort of Scandinavian paradise of there being a fairly high level of equality, things like there being lots of spending on things like healthcare and parental leave and all that kind of thing. We think that this kind of high standard of living is exactly the kind of thing that when states want to maintain, they do what Oscar tells you about. We have the freeloader problem of that welfare state being something that individual states will borrow as much as possible to push as far as possible, but it's not something that every single state can do at the same time. And the second thing that we note here is that when individual states are saying that they're going to offer that kind of thing, then it acts as a lure. So much as I do sound a bit like Nigel Farage when I say this, it is true that it is a greater incentive to move somewhere if you perceive that there's going to be a greater level of state spending on you. That means that it is much easier in those states like the United Kingdom to paint the picture of there being immigrants who are coming to steal your welfare, and that feeds into the kind of populist rhetoric, which means that there's greater unsustainability of the European Union as a political entity. And then further on this, then we think that the individualistic nature of the European Union itself encourages people to do things like borrowing a lot more money. When people borrow a lot more money, then that means they get into greater individual debt. That means that you get the parallel financial crises in places like Greece, which means that as a society, there's an unsustainability of European ideals. Secondly, how does the European Union respond to this kind of thing? Why is it undemocratic? So we think that there's two ways in which the European Union is fundamentally undemocratic and how this makes it unsustainable in the long term. Firstly, there's formal ways in which it's undemocratic, which I've already discussed. Things like you not being able to vote for MEPs across the continent. And secondly, in terms of practice, in terms of how people actually buy into it, because we don't think that fundamentally a lot of people do buy into the European Union. We note that turnout in European elections has been steadily declining. In 2014, only 42% of people across Europe turned out to vote. We think that this is absolutely staggeringly low. We also think that the kind of material that opposition offer on, oh, well, the US is bad too, isn't good enough. We think, well, yeah, actually, sure, the US political system is probably unsustainable too. The electoral college system is probably unsustainable too. We want an actual answer as to why this kind of analogy is actually accurate to this debate in which we think the European Union, in its current form and in the form it aspires to go to in terms of ever closer union, is actually sustainable. They have not given us that answer. We think that high levels of distrust are exactly the kinds of things that the European Union and people like Merkel pushing ever closer union at the same time as doing things like imposing undemocratic governments on Greece is the kind of thing that makes us unsustainable. It feeds into populism and it feeds into distrust. So what we get then is a sense of is across individual states in Europe there being a sort of internationalization of nationalism. There's the same kinds of rhetoric being used in different states, but all of those states see themselves as having oppositional interests. So we think that there's an erosion of any sense of national solidarity, particularly when Oscar tells you that there's things that things like freedom of movement are actually now being used as a way to exploit the worker across borders, rather than a way of like being able to actualize everybody in Europe and let them go wherever they want to go. So we think what this means that what you end up with is a European Union that is fundamentally unable to connect with the individuals, unable to connect with those people in Wales, it's unable to connect with the worker, it's unable to connect with the voter. That means that the people who really care, who really vote in the European elections, are people who vote for things like UKIP. That means that the agenda of the European Union becomes increasingly right-wing, becomes increasingly Eurosceptic, becomes increasingly unsustainable.